She thought about her two children and about her elderly mother who still hadn't been properly cared for. She had no other choice but to endure the situation, to silently suffer. Her mind was overwhelmed, torn between family obligations and the harsh reality she was facing. Seeing that Hugh wasn't saying anything, Dung sensed that the resistance was fading. The prey he had been waiting for was now within his grasp. He wasn't going to let this opportunity slip away. He needed to act fast. "Please, I beg you. I'm sorry, but I really want you. Please don't refuse me anymore," he said, desperation in his voice. "I'll keep this secret for you, I swear it." His words were laced with a mix of guilt and longing, but Hugh remained silent. She could barely bring herself to speak, but deep down, she knew there was no turning back now. She felt trapped in a situation where her only choice was to endure, to survive, for the sake of her children, for the sake of her mother. Her silence only fueled Dung's resolve. "I'm sorry, but I need you. Please don't push me away. I will help you keep this secret, I promise," he continued, his voice trembling slightly as he reached out for her. It was then that Hugh finally spoke, her voice filled with a quiet sadness. "It's not as simple as you think. You don't understand what I've been through. I've been forced into this." Her words hung heavy in the air, each one weighed down by the years of pain she had endured. Dung listened intently, a sense of disbelief washing over him as Hugh recounted her tale. She spoke of how she had been blackmailed by a man named Vu, how he had filmed her, threatened to expose her, to ruin her reputation and bring shame upon her family. She had been cornered, with no way out. "If I don't do what he says," Hugh continued, "he'll expose everything to the whole village. I couldn't bear that. I would lose everything, all my dignity, everything I've worked so hard to protect." She wiped her eyes, trying to hold back her tears. "There were times when I thought about ending it all, just to escape from this nightmare. But I couldn't. I have my mother, my children. How could I leave them like that?" Dung was stunned. The rage he felt toward Vu grew stronger, but at the same time he was forced to confront his own actions. "I hate that man. I truly do," he said through clenched teeth. "But I realize that I'm no better. I'm just like him. I've done wrong things too." For the first time in what seemed like forever, Hugh saw a glimmer of sincerity in his eyes. He took out his phone and, with a look of determination, started deleting the images and videos he had saved earlier. He deleted everything. No trace of it was left. "I'm sorry," he said softly as he wiped the screen clean. "I was wrong. I promise I won't hurt you. I just wanted you to know that I care." Hugh watched in shock as Dung took responsibility for his actions, deleting the very evidence that could have caused her harm. She hadn't expected this, not from him. She had expected him to take advantage of the situation, but instead, he had acted out of genuine care for her. "Thank you," she whispered, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you for doing this. I never thought anyone would care this much." Dung looked up at her, a faint smile on his face, though there was still sadness in his eyes. "It's the least I could do, but what about Vu? What happens with his phone? Does he still have everything on it?" Hugh frowned, a little lost in thought. "I don't know. I'm not sure where he's keeping it, but I do know that he keeps everything on his phone, the videos, the photos, all of it. He's probably still holding it over me." "Then we have to act quickly," Dung said, his voice firm. "You need to make sure all of that stuff is gone, for good. We can't risk him using it against you again." Hugh nodded. "But I don't know how to do it. The phone is locked, and I'm not sure how to delete everything properly." Dung thought for a moment. "It's an iPhone, right? Then you need to delete everything, not just from the gallery, but also from the recently deleted folder. It's not enough to just delete the photos. You have to remove them completely." He handed her his phone and guided her step by step, showing her how to erase every trace of the damning material. Finally, Hugh began to understand how it was done. But the real challenge remained. How would they get their hands on Vu's phone? That, too, was no easy task. Hugh knew the password to his phone, only she knew it, and so far that secret had kept her safe. If Vu had realized that she had access to his phone, things could have taken a dangerous turn, but she had been careful, keeping it hidden, waiting for the right moment. "Don't worry," Hugh reassured him. "I know the code. I can get to his phone when the time is right. I just need to be careful." Greetings to all of you, my dear friends. Sometimes danger doesn't lurk far away, but is right next door, just beside our very homes. Have you ever felt the weight of that kind of danger? The kind that creeps up on you when you least expect it? This is the story of a woman whose life took an unimaginable turn in an instant. Her husband, caught up in the dangerous world of gambling, was sent to prison, leaving her alone with 2 young children. The family, once happy and complete, was suddenly thrust into uncertainty and fear. But the worst was yet to come. One fateful day, she became the target of a sinister man with a cruel and twisted heart. Could the nightmare she was living ever end? Would she ever find peace again, or was her fate sealed? Let's journey together through this story where hope and despair collide, and a mother's love fights against the darkness. Our story takes place in a rural area of Bacjiang province, where the fields stretch out for miles and the villages remain largely untouched by the bustling modern world. The people here live simple lives, often working the land to grow their food. The land, though generous at times, could also be unforgiving. It was a life filled with hard work, sweat, and struggle. There was little room for luxury, and the future seemed as uncertain as the weather. Life was tough, and many villagers had to find ways to survive. Some worked in the nearby factories, while others left for foreign lands, hoping to send money back home. For many, these were the only options available. The chance to escape the harsh realities of their existence to find a better life was a dream that they held onto tightly. Hugh was a young woman who married at the age of 18. Her husband, Thai, was a strong and determined man who, even in his youth, had always dreamt of a better future. Thai, who was 6 years older than Hugh, was known in the village for his hard-working nature. Both were born and raised in the same village, where everyone knew each other's business. One day, as Thai was working in the fields, he first noticed Hugh. She was young, beautiful, and radiant with the promise of youth. It was during that moment that he felt something deep stir within him, something he couldn't ignore. Thai found himself thinking about her constantly, and soon enough, his feelings turned to love. He couldn't imagine his life without her. He approached his parents with the intention of asking for her hand in marriage. To his delight, Hugh, too, had fallen for him. She admired his strength and his determination to build a future, and so they were married. The couple settled into married life, and soon they welcomed their first child, a son named Tan. Though they were happy, their lives were far from easy. Thai, who had always dreamed of something more than the simple life in the village, made a bold decision. He decided to leave his wife and child behind and seek work in a foreign land. At that time, Vietnam was still recovering from the scars of war and economic hardship. But with the opening of the country's economy, opportunities began to appear abroad. Singapore, a country in Southeast Asia with a rapidly developing economy, became a destination for many Vietnamese workers. Thai, like many others, hoped to find better job prospects there, to earn enough money to give his family a future they could be proud of. The decision to leave wasn't easy. Hugh, although understanding, felt a deep sorrow as she watched her husband leave. She had to raise their son alone, without him by her side. As the days passed, she would often find herself in tears, missing him more than words could express. But she made a promise to herself and to her husband. She would wait. She would wait for his return, believing that their lives would be better once he came back. She would endure the loneliness for the sake of their future. The years passed slowly. Life was hard for Hugh, but she kept going. She took care of their home, raised their child, and tried to remain hopeful. And then, one day, Thai returned. After many years of hard work, he came back with a considerable amount of money, ready to fulfill the promise he had made to her. When Hugh saw him standing at the doorstep, her heart skipped a beat. He was still the man she had fallen in love with, though he had aged slightly from the hardships of working abroad. He was tired, but his eyes still held the same warmth and love that had first drawn her to him. Their reunion was filled with emotion. The entire village came to greet him, and their house was filled with the sounds of joy and celebration. But even amidst all the noise, it was clear that Hugh and Thai longed to be alone together. They hadn't shared a quiet moment in years. That night, after all the visitors had left, they finally lay down together in their bed. Hugh clung to him, her voice breaking as she said, "I missed this, being with you. It's been so long." Thai, though exhausted from the journey, smiled softly. He reached out and gently wiped away her tears. "The work was hard, but I did it for you and for our son. I have the strength to keep going because of you." Hugh, ever playful, teased him, "Now that you're back, you can't leave me again, right? And you better not have found any other woman while you were away." Thai laughed and reassured her, "No one could replace you. Besides, I'm too tired to even think about anyone else. How could I when I have a wife like you?" Thai was indeed fortunate. Hugh had grown into a woman whose beauty left all the men in the village envious. They admired her from afar, wishing they could have someone like her. Thai, however, was the lucky one who had won her heart. That night, the couple was reunited and their love rekindled in a way they hadn't felt in years. But even after the joy of their reunion, the challenges of life remained. The next morning, Hugh rose early, as she always did. She had responsibilities to attend to. She glanced over at her son, Han, still fast asleep, his face a perfect reflection of his father. "He looks just like you," she thought to herself, a smile spreading across her face. "He'll grow up to be as strong and handsome as you, I'm sure of it." Later that morning, as Hugh was feeding the chickens in the yard, Thai came up behind her and embraced her. She was startled and quickly turned to him. "Wasn't last night enough? Be careful. My mother might see us." Thai, laughing, responded, "I don't care about anyone else. I'm holding my wife. Who else could I possibly hold?" The years apart had only made their bond stronger. They had survived the distance, the hardships, and the fears, and now they were together again. But as they embraced the happiness of their reunion, little did they know, darker days lay ahead, days that would test their love, their faith, and their very survival. This story, though filled with love and emotion, is a reminder that life is unpredictable. In the blink of an eye, things can change. We must cherish the moments we have, hold on to those we love, and never give up hope, even when the road ahead seems dark. Stay tuned, as this journey is far from over. Greetings to all of you, dear friends. Sometimes danger is closer than we think, lurking right beside us, hidden in plain sight. But admitting it, that's another matter. It's embarrassing, right? But let me tell you this story. Thai was standing outside, gazing at the land around his home. In his mind, plans were already beginning to form. He turned to his wife and said, "Honey, I'm thinking about building a small shed behind the house. Not just any shed, but one that could be used to sell goods, something to support our income. We could start selling all sorts of things, small items like a convenience store." His wife, Hugh, nodded, agreeing that it sounded like a solid plan. "You know, Thai," she said, "there aren't many stores around here, and it could work out well. Plus, the location is great. But I've been thinking, why don't we extend the shed and build a small room to connect it? That way, during the day, we'll have a place to rest and eat, and we can still keep an eye on the shop. It would be more convenient." Thai smiled and laughed. "I didn't think of that. You're not just beautiful, you're smart too," he teased, happy that his wife had such great ideas. Hugh, flattered by the compliment, felt a sense of pride. She could already see the future where the two of them had a steady income. The choices he made would shape his future and his family's for better or worse. Stay with us as we continue this story of choices, consequences, and redemption. What will Thai decide? How will this journey unfold? The story is far from over. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What would you do in Thai's situation? How would you handle the temptation of easy money? But is that really the end of it all? The forces that once turned a blind eye when there was an opportunity to climb the social ladder now saw a chance and grabbed it all at once, like a fisherman casting his net to catch a big haul. Since the day Hugh took on the job of writing lottery numbers, her life had become busier. During the day, she helped her husband sell drinks and groceries at their small shop. In the evenings, she balanced two tasks, holding a pen in one hand and a mobile phone in the other, constantly jotting down numbers. It wasn't just a job, it attracted more customers to their shop as well. The beverage stall became the perfect front for their lottery business. The young people who hung out there not only enjoyed their drinks but also took the opportunity to ask Hugh to write lottery numbers for them. Thanks to this, the family's income grew steadily. However, Thai's personality started to change. He seemed satisfied with what he had and began to adopt a lazy attitude. He would lie down in the afternoon to nap, but whenever a customer came to buy groceries, he would show clear signs of irritation. Then, one day, he turned to his wife and said, "Why don't we just focus on the drink stall? Running the grocery business is barely profitable and it takes so much effort. But the drink stall still brings in income. What do you think?" Hugh hesitated, considering his words. "But think about it. Selling drinks means we have more flexible hours, and it also hides our lottery business quite well. Running a grocery store, especially when I'm lying down to rest, then having to get up to serve customers, it's really frustrating." Thai listened, but his mind wasn't completely convinced. Then suddenly, he had an idea. "Wait, I've got it. What if we add 2 tables for beer, like a hangout spot for the young people? It would help both with the lottery business and the drink sales. What do you think?" Hugh thought for a moment, nodding. "I guess that could work, but wouldn't it be a big investment?" "Don't worry," Thai replied confidently. "I know a supplier who sells at half the price of other places. I'll check it out tomorrow and let you know." And so, the grocery shop was closed, and the space was converted into a beer hangout. The number of young people hanging out increased, and the number of lottery customers rose dramatically. Thai no longer had to work hard selling goods. He just sat back, played games with customers, and collected money. Sometimes he'd get lucky and win, sometimes he'd lose, but he enjoyed the excitement, so it didn't matter. Time passed, and Thai and Hugh saved up a fair amount of money. They decided to tear down their old house and build a bigger, more spacious one. After the house was finished, Thai felt a sense of pride. He felt like he had it all: a big house, a beautiful wife, 2 healthy sons, and financial stability without the stress of working like others. But life, as it often does, had its own plans. Despite having everything, Thai learned the hard way that fortune doesn't last forever. One day, during a crackdown on illegal lottery operations, Thai was arrested. No matter how much money he had spent to try to avoid it, the sentence of 1 year in prison couldn't be escaped. The worst part? Thai was sent to a prison in a rural province, far from home. In prison, every day was a struggle for survival. Unlike the easy life he had before, now he had to work hard just to earn enough for a simple meal. For a man like Thai, who had been living the high life for so long, this was a nightmare come true. When the verdict was handed down, Hugh and their children cried their hearts out. She was so worried about her husband. Would he be treated poorly in prison? Would he survive the harsh conditions? Her mother-in-law, along with Thai's older brother Long, were equally concerned. They didn't want Hugh to bear the burden of both caring for her children and looking after her elderly mother-in-law alone. Long, the eldest brother, understood the situation. Though his family's financial situation was more modest, they weren't suffering. Thai, as the youngest of 4 siblings, had always been a bit spoiled. Long and his siblings, Tui, Vu, and Vu's family, lived nearby, but Vu had long been known for his bad habits, especially his drinking and mistreating his wife and children. Even more troubling, Vu had secretly admired Hugh for a long time. He had always waited for the right moment to make his move and claim her for himself. Now that Thai was in prison, it seemed like the perfect opportunity for Vu. On the outside, he pretended to sympathize with his brother's misfortune, but deep down, he was plotting to take advantage of the situation. He saw this as his chance to get closer to Hugh and perhaps, finally, have her for himself. The story of Vu's descent. Every day, Vu spent his time at the local gambling den, and when he wasn't there, he was usually at home, drinking and hanging out. He decided to open a car wash business, but it was mostly just for his wife to run. Every afternoon, Vu would go play football with a group of young men. Only during harvest season did he find time to earn a little extra money with his old, worn-out tricycle. But despite his occasional attempts to make ends meet, his life was dominated by a reckless love for alcohol and a careless attitude towards responsibility. It was this constant drinking and irresponsible behavior that earned him a bad reputation. People often criticized his lack of discipline, and his wife, who had no choice but to endure his behavior, was often subjected to harsh treatment. Late at night, Vu would force her to massage his back and wait on him, threatening her with violence if she refused. His children, witnessing the cruelty of their father, lived in constant fear. They obeyed him without question, too afraid to speak out or stand up to his harshness. This cycle of oppression continued for many years until his children grew up, married, and moved away to start their own lives. They finally escaped the grasp of their tyrannical father. It was only then that they were free from his abuse. One evening, Vu went drinking with his friends at a nearby bar. When he came home later that night, he staggered as he tried to make his way inside, though he wasn't so drunk that he needed help. He had a reputation for holding his liquor well, drinking steadily from the beginning of the night until the very end without ever collapsing. He was quite proud of that ability. As he stepped onto the first step of the stairs leading into the house, he heard water splashing from the bathroom of his younger brother's house. He mumbled to himself, "It's almost 9 p.m. Who is still taking a bath at this hour?" He paused for a moment, wondering who it could be, but then his eyes brightened like headlights in the dark. A familiar but dangerous thought crept into his mind. His desire for his sister-in-law, his brother's wife, surged within him like a potent, intoxicating drug. The land that Vu and his brother had inherited from their parents had been divided between them years ago. Vu's brother, Thai, got the larger portion, which extended all the way from the road down to the bottom of the hill. Vu's house, built in a long, narrow style, was located at the top of the land. It stretched back to make use of the limited space for a small shop. Thai, on the other hand, had more room to work with, so his house was larger and square, with a much more spacious layout. Despite the differences in size, Vu's house felt cramped and unpleasant in comparison to Thai's. An awkward feature of their shared property was that the bathrooms were in close proximity. Vu's brother, Thai, had recently added a small annex for a shop, which made Vu's house seem even more suffocating. On most summer nights, Vu's children, the boys Than and Duong, would sneak out to hang out with their friends. They would walk to a nearby village where the cool breeze from the rice fields helped them cool off. The two boys, though young, were quite mature for their age. They always returned home by 10:30 p.m., a habit they followed without fail. But tonight, something was different. The shower in Vu's house was broken, but the bathroom downstairs was still functional. However, the doorknob was also faulty, and though Ty had tried to fix it, he had yet to complete the repair. Luckily, there was a latch inside the door, so that brought some reassurance. As usual, Hugh, Vu's wife, was busy running the shop. She had a full day ahead of her, taking care of business and making sure everything was in order. She would only get a chance to eat after finishing her work in the afternoon. By the time she finished her meal, she would check the sales book and then continue attending to the customers, mostly young men who came in the evenings. On this particular evening, only 2 young men were sitting in the living room, sipping drinks and chatting. Hugh felt comfortable enough to leave them alone, trusting that they were decent and well-behaved. She didn't feel the need to make any announcements or draw attention to herself, especially to avoid making her situation any more complicated. Vu arrived at the shop, and as he walked in, he noticed the 2 young men. He asked, "Have you seen Hugh around?" The 2 boys replied, "Oh, is that you, Uncle Vu? She went out back a little while ago. Maybe she's up in the house getting something." Vu nodded and made his way out back. As he passed the bathroom, he noticed a light on. His heart leapt with anticipation. He smiled to himself, certain now that his earlier thoughts were correct. He saw that the clothes Hugh had worn earlier were hanging by the doorknob, confirming that she was indeed in the bathroom. His pulse quickened as he felt a strange excitement bubbling within him. A feeling of desire surged through him, and he moved closer to the bathroom door. As he crouched down to peek through the small gap between the door and the floor, he could see Hugh's feet, a sight that only intensified his longing. But that wasn't enough. Vu wanted to see more. His thoughts became clouded with temptation, and he considered taking action. He looked around quickly, then reached up to pull aside a towel hanging on the door, hoping for a better view. There, through the small gap in the door, he finally saw her. Hugh, in her graceful, sensual form, stood there in the dim light. Despite having given birth to 2 children, she still had a captivating beauty that entranced him. Vu's eyes widened as he watched her move, every step she took fueling his desires even more. His mind raced with thoughts of what he might do, and for a fleeting moment, he considered breaking down the door and acting on his impulses. But even in his lustful haze, a sliver of his conscience held him back. It was just enough to stop him from giving in completely to his darker instincts. Out of a deep sense of ethics and responsibility, he feared that if Hugh were to shout or react suddenly, everything would fall apart. If he acted in haste, he might lose everything. In the end, he decided to discreetly build a wall beside him to avoid detection, then quietly moved to the front room and sat there, waiting. After a short while, Hugh opened the bathroom door and stepped out. Upon seeing her, Vu immediately spoke. "Hu, tomorrow, can you tell Thon to help me carry some rice from the field? He should stop spending all his time hanging around with his friends. If he keeps this up, he'll never get anything done." Hugh looked uncertain. "But I'm afraid he won't want to. Right now he's enjoying the cool air from the air conditioner. How can you expect him to go out and carry rice?" Vu persisted. "Well, if you want him to grow up properly, he needs to learn hard work. Let me speak to him directly. Maybe that will make him understand." Hugh was still doubtful. "You know how he is." "He's always so spoiled. How could he possibly do anything meaningful in the future? We can't keep babying him forever." Sighing, Vu stood up to leave. "All right, I'll head home now. It's not a big deal, but just tell him, okay?" "All right, Uncle. See you." After their conversation, Vu left, feeling a sense of relief and satisfaction as he felt he had achieved a small part of his goal. The days quickly passed by, and before long, 6 months had gone since Thai had entered the prison. Hugh continued to struggle every day, managing not only the household, but also working tirelessly to provide for the family. She carried the responsibilities of both a mother and a father. Her eldest son, Thien Ind, was now 16 years old and had just entered high school. However, his lazy and carefree attitude kept him from focusing on his studies. As a result, Hugh had to spend extra money to ensure he could attend a public school, hoping that at least this would keep him away from bad influences and troublemakers. She had been forced to pay extra to secure a spot for him at the public school. Hugh reasoned, it's the lesser evil. If he were placed in a private school surrounded by the wrong crowd, who knows what might happen to him? At least here, he's more likely to stay on track. Her younger son, Duong, was now in the 3rd grade. He seemed to be more obedient and focused than his older brother, with better results in school. However, Duong lacked the sharp wit and street-smart edge that Than had developed. Hugh was grateful that at least one of her children showed promise, yet despite these small blessings, Hye found herself overwhelmed. She juggled housework and the struggle to make ends meet. What she longed for most was for her 2 sons to stop causing trouble so she wouldn't have to constantly worry. Whenever her husband Thai was home, his presence seemed to act as a deterrent. The boys were more likely to behave when he was around, but his constant absence made it difficult for Hugh to manage everything alone. Thai was often incarcerated, and the family would visit him once every few months. The money for the visits wasn't much, but Hugh always had to pay a significant sum to the prison guards, hoping to get her husband a less grueling job inside. Every time she made these payments, it felt like her entire salary was being drained. Sometimes it felt like a game of survival. These bribes were costly, and Hugh was careful in how she dealt with the officers. She was always polite, careful to avoid conflict, but she knew that any wrong move could jeopardize her husband's situation. If the guards became too demanding, Hugh would refuse them, but she had to do so in a way that wouldn't draw attention. The cost of visiting her husband and managing the bribes was constantly weighing on her, yet Hugh had no choice but to continue, as these efforts were the only way to maintain any control over her husband's situation in prison. The financial strain caused her to neglect her own health. She was too tired, too busy to focus on herself. Looking at her sister-in-law, who seemed to have it all together, Vu couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sympathy for Hugh. To him, Hugh was like a goddess, someone he admired deeply. He would do anything to have her in his life, and despite the months that had passed, he had yet to find the opportunity to make that a reality. Late at night, when he lay awake, Vu would think about the night he had seen Hugh's beauty in its entirety. Just recalling the image made his body stir with desire. His thoughts turned to his wife, who was far from attractive in comparison, and he found himself distancing from her more and more. Often Vu would visit Hugh's house, spending time with the local men while they played cards and talked. He couldn't help but feel irritated whenever the men's eyes lingered on Hugh, admiring her beauty. How dare they, he thought. Who were these men to ogle his sister-in-law? In his mind, no one had the right to approach her. One of these men was Lao Tung, a wrinkled old man with yellow teeth from years of smoking. Tung was a notorious womanizer, and he had been eyeing Hugh for a long time. He'd often come to the cafe trying to flirt with her, but Hugh always avoided his advances. She was polite but firm in rejecting him, making it clear that her heart belonged to one man, her husband Thai. One day, Vu's son came home and proudly presented Hugh with an iPhone 4, a gift for her to use for communication. However, after a week of inspecting the phone, Vu discovered a feature that would change everything. He could recover deleted photos. A sinister idea formed in his mind. Vu smirked as a plan began to take shape. With this new knowledge, Vu believed he had found a way to make Hugh his. A devious grin spread across his face as he plotted the next steps in his twisted scheme. Little did Hugh know, the nightmare that was about to unfold would shatter the fragile peace she had fought so hard to maintain. The bedroom of the couple was quiet that evening. However, in recent days, the water distributor had launched a highly attractive discount program for dealers, which made Hugh eager to buy in bulk and resell at a profit. The program was an opportunity she couldn't miss. At the same time, the youth in the village had started indulging in bad habits, pursuing social vices that led to problems like theft. Hugh had recently heard reports of chickens being stolen from homes, accompanied by loud arguments. Fearing for her safety, she decided to stay overnight in the upstairs room to avoid the possibility of thieves breaking in and taking away her stock. To be safe, she called Duong, asking him to sleep with her. At least with mother and son together, it's safer than me alone. Vu noticed this too and decided to make plans. In just a few days, he would have to convince his father to send Than and Duong out of the house for good. Vu took out his phone and called Long. Xin Chao, Bak Long. Hey, it's Vu. In 3 days, I'll try to talk to my dad about sending Than and Duong out. What's the plan for the family's ritual this year? Ah, it's just like every year. Why are you asking about this now? I don't usually hear you bring it up. Thuy called me earlier. She said that her family and Quangs will be coming over. Okay, got it. I'll prepare extra food. I've been raising a pig for 7 or 8 months now. You should come early to help me out. Vu agreed and immediately made arrangements. He quickly dialed Quan's number. Hello, Quan? Hey, it's Vu here. Oh, Cow. What's up? The ritual for Grandpa is coming up this weekend. Are you bringing your wife and kids? Ah, really? I'm not sure. It's a long trip. You've missed the ritual for years, Quan. You're not going to skip it this time, are you? This year, Backlong is raising a huge pig. Make sure you come. If not, don't even think about showing your face to me. All right, I'll be there. Thanks for letting me know. After finishing his call with Quan, Vu continued his preparations. He knew he could rely on his family's reputation, and no one would dare to back out when their uncle was involved. The family began planning. The pig would be slaughtered on Saturday morning, and Sunday would be the big ritual for the father. This time, Saturday fell on the 10th of June, just in time for Tan's school break. Vu informed both Tan and Duong about the plan. Tonight, make sure you go to Backlong's house early. We'll need to help him prepare the feast. There will be a lot of people coming. The two boys' eyes lit up at the mention of the feast. They respected their elders and were always thrilled by the prospect of family gatherings, especially when there would be gifts. We'll go early, Vu. Let us ask Mom first, and then we'll come over. Good boys, Vu smiled to himself, pleased with their enthusiasm. He could already feel his plan coming together. Later that evening, as Tian and Duong headed to Long's house, Vu rushed to the village tavern where Hui was working. The air was filled with the sound of laughter as the young men played cards and chatted. Vu sat with them, waiting for the right moment to execute his plan. Vu suggested a game where the loser would pay for the drinks. The group happily agreed, and the beer kept flowing. Although Vu couldn't match the young men's speed or skill in the game, that wasn't his goal. His real objective was to drink as much beer as possible, buying time for his scheme to unfold. The others quickly noticed that Vu wasn't much of a player, and they played along, deliberately losing to him. The game stretched on longer than usual, giving Vu just the excuse he needed to keep drinking. As the night wore on, he slowed down deliberately, dragging the game out. When he realized he was about to lose, he asked Hugh for another glass of beer. I'm sorry, I've spilled some beer on you. Vu apologized clumsily, pretending to be drunk. I was careless. I must be tipsy. Oh, it's fine. Let me get you a new one and go change your clothes, Hugh replied. Vu smiled weakly, feeling his plan move forward. After finishing his beer, he pretended to miss a shot in the game. "All right, I'm done. I'll leave now. You guys go home too. It's late, and I'll pay for the drinks." The young men said their goodbyes, eager to get home. Vu, now alone, reached for 200,000 Vietnamese dong from his pocket and left it on the table before heading into the back room to wait. Vu hid under the bed, carefully watching the scene. After a while, Hugh returned upstairs, changed into fresh clothes made of linen. She walked into the room and noticed the money on the table. Did they leave already? She murmured to herself. They left without causing trouble. At least they didn't try to skip out on paying. She picked up the money, feeling relieved, though unaware of Vu's true intentions lurking in the shadows. Vu smiled to himself from his hidden spot, confident that everything was falling into place. Tonight, the plans he had carefully set in motion would finally come to fruition. This was only the beginning. Tho quickly began packing up her belongings, getting ready to close the shop and go to bed. But there was still so much stock left. Bottles of water, goods, all scattered around. Hugh hesitated, unsure of where she should sleep tonight. The last few days had been a whirlwind. Thang Tan and Thang Duong had gone over to Bak Long's house since the night before. She was left alone. Sleeping by herself felt uncomfortable. The thought of it made her uneasy, but there was still all that merchandise to look after. Would the thieves be lurking around? Would they take advantage of the situation? She couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. After a moment, Hugh sighed, resigned. Well, one night won't hurt, she thought. It'll be fine. With that, she locked up the shop, went to the restroom to freshen up, and after that, climbed into the bed in the upper room. She turned off the lights and settled into bed, laying down under the wooden frame. As the darkness spread through the room, Vu lay hidden under the bed, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous glint. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The room was completely silent. His heart raced, and every small sound made him tense. If Hugh heard a noise, she would wake up and raise an alarm, alerting the whole village. This was a place where he could easily be cornered, a dead end where no escape would be possible. One wrong move and he would have no choice but to face the consequences. Vu felt his pulse quicken, his heart pounded. All he needed was one small mistake, one noise, and everything could be over. But he had practiced being quiet, slipping in and out of places unnoticed. When his old motorcycle broke down, he'd often have to crawl under it to make repairs. It wasn't the first time he had to crawl into small spaces. His experience made him skilled at this sort of thing. After a long while, he finally slipped out from under the bed and silently glanced upward. Hugh was still lying there, breathing steadily in her sleep. The time had come. His breath hitched. He quietly tossed his clothes aside and turned on his phone. The screen's light illuminated the dark room just enough for him to see what he needed. Well, the girl I've been dreaming of is right here in front of me, he thought. He took a few slow steps toward the bed, his mind racing with fantasies. He could already imagine the scene. This night would be his. And not just tonight, but forever. He would be the one to replace Thai as her husband. He could already see it, their life together. His eyes fell on Hugh. "Is she not wearing an undergarment?" he muttered under his breath. It was strange. He leaned in closer and turned on his phone again, using the screen's light to examine her more closely. He smiled to himself. He had planned this carefully, down to the smallest detail. His ability to think on his feet had been tested time and again, and now it was working in his favor. The light from the phone screen flickered slightly as he zoomed in on her. He knew this moment would be priceless. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction. With this, there's no way she could accuse me. She'd never dare, he thought smugly. He hesitated for a moment. There was something that felt off. The dim room, the shadows. He held his breath. A sudden sigh from Hugh made his heart skip a beat. He froze, terrified that she might have woken up, but no, she was still asleep, unaware of his presence. He let out a small breath, relieved, and took another step closer. His intentions were clear. He had no intention of stopping. He was about to act when he remembered the phone in his hand. These photos, they will protect me, he thought, admiring the shots he had taken. They would be the perfect shield. No one would believe Hugh, not with this evidence. But just as he was about to move again, something unexpected happened. Hugh stirred. Her body shifted and she let out a quiet breath, as if sensing something was off. Vu, startled, stepped back quickly, holding his breath in the silence. His heart pounded. Could she have woken up? Was she aware of him? Vu held still, barely daring to move. He kept his eyes fixed on her, trying to gauge if she had noticed him. There was no sound, nothing to indicate that she was awake, but the moment felt tense. For a moment, it seemed like time stood still. Hugh was still sleeping, but now Vu could feel the weight of the situation more than ever. She must be so tired, he thought, watching her closely. The stress of the day must have worn her down. She mumbled softly in her sleep, the words barely audible. 6 months. It's been so long. Vu didn't know what she was talking about, but it didn't matter. He had his sights set on something else. His gaze moved lower, tracing the curves of her body. He had to admit she was beautiful, even in her sleep. The soft rise and fall of her chest, the way her lips parted slightly as she breathed, everything about her seemed so vulnerable, so perfect. But then, suddenly, Hugh opened her eyes. Her body tensed, and Vu felt a jolt of panic run through him. Had she seen him? Had she noticed? Was this the end? I woke up suddenly, the nightlight flickering on. What's going on? Why is it you? What are you doing to me? I gasped, confused and frightened. Oh my God, Hugh. I'm so sorry, but I've been in love with you for such a long time now. Please, just this one time, let me. His words were desperate, filled with emotion, but they brought no comfort. Hugh felt a rush of tears, but she couldn't fight the reality that had unfolded before her. She had never experienced this kind of pain before. How could she, a woman who had never been burdened with the toils of physical labor, possibly withstand a man like him, a man who worked tirelessly, day and night, lifting heavy loads from the fields? She shook her head, trying to free herself from the overwhelming emotions. No, don't. Stop, please. This is enough, she pleaded, her voice trembling as the man continued. His words, harsh and relentless, echoed in her ears, yet he didn't stop. He was like a wild beast, starving, preying upon his victim. He was swift. Before she could react, he had already grabbed her phone, taking pictures of her, capturing her in her weakest moment. Hugh's heart sank. How can I get out of this? What should I do? She thought desperately. She knew the light from her phone was flashing, signaling the trap. She had to act quickly. With a burst of energy, she reached out to snatch the phone from his hand, but he was faster. He locked the screen with a password, leaving her powerless, trapped in her own torment. The images on the phone now belonged to him, and Hugh felt a deep, unspoken rage building up inside her. She couldn't put her emotions into words. Her tears just kept falling, flowing freely down her face. I betrayed Thai. How could I have let this happen? What should I tell him? What will I do now? These thoughts ran wild through her mind, one after the other. The phone lay there, showing pictures of her in a way she could never have imagined. They were beautiful, but in her heart, they felt like poison. I can't erase them. I don't even want to. But how could I? What if someone sees them? Hugh's voice cracked as she tried to warn him. Delete those photos, or I'll report you to the police. What you've done is illegal. Vu just smirked, unbothered. Go ahead, report me, he said coldly. But do you think anyone will believe you? These pictures, everyone in the village will see them. Do you think Thai will still respect you if he finds out? He's in prison, and he will wonder. What will he think when he sees his wife with another man? What will the others think? Will Than and Duong be able to look people in the eye again? He laughed, a cruel, taunting sound. I have nothing to lose. But today I'm getting exactly what I wanted. Vu took his time, savoring his victory, as Hugh's world seemed to collapse around her. Her mind swirled with confusion and disgust. Before, Thai had been a good husband, but his disinterest in her had grown over time. His health had declined as he turned more to laziness and indulgence, unable to care for her like he used to. Thai would have never done something like this. But Vu was different. He didn't work hard, but he kept up with the younger crowd, playing football, drinking beer, and sometimes even engaging in multiple affairs. Vu had energy and a sharp mind, but it was all twisted, filled with cruelty and malice. At 60, he was stronger than most men half his age. Now Hugh felt helpless, unable to escape his clutches. She was emotionally drained, physically broken. What could she do? What was left for her? She tried to block out the horrifying memories of the night. Her dignity was gone, and all she could think about was how to get through the coming days. How will I explain this to Thai? She wondered. How can I live with myself after this? What will the future hold for me? The night dragged on, but Hugh remained motionless, trying to numb herself. Vu, satisfied, stood up, quickly tidied up, and left without a word. Before he left, he turned to her and said coldly, "If this comes out, your life will be ruined. You should know your place and keep your family together. I'll come to see you again soon, and you better not do anything foolish." Hugh heard the door slam shut behind him, and his mocking laugh still echoed in her ears. Her entire being screamed in pain and rage. She crawled toward the bathroom, her body heavy, the weight of what had happened pressing down on her chest. The floor was wet with her tears and the remnants of the night's horrors. Inside the bathroom, she stared at herself in the mirror. Her hair was tangled and wild, her face pale and tear-streaked. "How could this happen to me?" she whispered, her voice broken. "What will I tell Thai? What will I do now?" She stepped into the shower, turning on the water, trying to wash away the feeling of contamination. But the water couldn't erase the shame, the horror of what had just happened. She cried for herself, for Thai, for everything she had lost. She wept for her broken innocence and the uncertain future ahead of her. After what felt like an eternity, she finally stepped out of the shower, trying to gather herself. The photos were a weapon in Vu's hands now, a cruel reminder of her vulnerability. Her family's happiness hung by a thread, and she could do nothing but wait for what would come next. The next day, Hugh woke up later than usual. It was already 8 o'clock in the morning when she finally left her bed. She moved through the house, trying to pretend everything was normal, cleaning up the mess from the previous night, but everything felt different. It felt like her life had shifted, and she couldn't find her way back. By noon, she was over at Long's house, helping prepare for the meal. But her mind was far away, lost in the turmoil of everything that had just happened. What would she do now? Could she ever recover from this nightmare? She didn't know. She could only keep going, hoping that somehow, someday, she would find peace. The family gathered together, and the atmosphere was lively and full of joy, as everyone enjoyed being with their loved ones. However, amidst the laughter and chatter, there was one person who couldn't fully join in the happiness. It was Hugh. She felt a deep sense of longing. "If only my husband were here with us today," she thought. "It would be so much more joyful." Today was only Saturday, not yet the day of the memorial, but since they were on a holiday break, the family had decided to organize a big meal. It had been a long time since they had hosted such a large gathering. The reason for the lavish celebration was because many of the younger relatives worked far away and couldn't come home often. Without their return, there was no point in hosting such a grand meal, but now, with everyone present, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to do so. Long's family wasn't exactly wealthy, but they had always loved a good celebration, a tradition that had been passed down from previous generations. Every Saturday morning, they slaughtered a pig for the family meals, but it was never enough for all 3 meals of the day. So that afternoon, Quan and Quang decided to spend a few million dong to buy a special fish, a sturgeon, to treat everyone. While the 2 brothers went out to buy the fish, the women in the house were busy preparing the pig to cook the next day. There was a small complication, though. Aunt Tui wanted to make some minced pork for the small children, but the blender at Long's house had broken. Seeing this, she suggested that she go home to fetch another one. However, when she tried to ask for help, Than and Duong were nowhere to be found. They had disappeared, possibly off playing soccer, so Hui decided to call for help. As she was about to leave, Vu, who was nearby, overheard and offered to go back with her to get the blender. "Don't worry, I'll take care of it. It's on my way anyway." Reluctantly, Hugh agreed. She didn't want to be alone with Vu, knowing he might try to take advantage of the situation, but there was no choice. Vu, eager to make his move, was already waiting outside, and Hugh, against her better judgment, climbed onto his motorbike. As they made their way down a quiet, empty road, Vu kept stealing glances at her in the rearview mirror. He began to drive slowly, and before Hugh realized it, his hand was on her thigh. Hugh, immediately uncomfortable, slapped his hand away and shouted, "What are you doing?" She was furious, but Vu, acting as if it were just a harmless joke, simply smirked and sped up, making it difficult for her to jump off the bike. They soon arrived at Hugh's house, but as she was about to enter, Vu rushed toward her. "Aren't you going to let me in?" he called out, but Hugh slammed the door behind her. "Don't even think about it," she shouted back. Vu, though, was not one to give up easily. He knew that winning her over in one night was impossible, so he began plotting. He had a scheme in mind. Vu understood that he could never break Hugh's spirit, but he also knew the power of his leverage, the pictures, the ones he had of her, which could ruin everything if they were exposed. He had been blackmailing her, and now, with the threat of those photos hanging over her, he decided to make one last offer. The next day, Hugh sat in her room, her mind swirling with the thoughts of what Vu had said. The blackmailing photos, the idea of losing her dignity, it all seemed like a cruel game, but deep down, Hugh knew she couldn't allow him to continue to hold this power over her. Yet, the consequences of refusing his offer seemed even worse. As Hugh continued to ponder, the phone rang. She had hoped it might be Than calling back, but it was Tui. "Why are you taking so long?" Tui asked. "I had a customer earlier, but I'm on my way now," she replied. "All right, hurry up so we can finish everything." Hugh sighed, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. It felt as if fate itself was forcing her to accept this cruel offer. When Hugh stepped outside to wait for Tui, Vu was already there. Without a word, he gestured for her to get on the motorbike. As they traveled along the same deserted road, Hugh felt a sense of dread. Vu slowed down again and, as if rehearsed, casually placed his hand on her thigh. "I've got a proposal for you," he said, his voice low and unsettling. "If you agree to be with me just one more time, I'll delete the photos. You won't have to worry about me ever again." "Are you crazy?" Hugh snapped, anger flooding through her. "You think I'll just give in to you? You've already done enough damage." But Vu, unperturbed, continued his manipulative talk. "I'll delete the photos, but you need to give me what I want. Just one night, Hugh, and I promise I'll leave you and your family alone forever." Hugh was torn. The offer was tempting in some ways. It could erase the hold he had over her, but it came at a high cost. She could not risk ruining her family. It was then that Hugh made her decision. Later that evening, after dinner, Hugh found herself alone with Vu. She walked with him to the back of the house where he was waiting. "So, you've made up your mind, haven't you?" he said, his voice oozing with anticipation. You've agreed to my proposal, right? Hugh, her mind resolute, stared at him coldly. I've agreed to a one-time deal, she said, her voice steady. You promised to delete the pictures and you will never bother me or my family again. Do you understand? Vu smiled, knowing he had won. Of course, he replied. You'll get what you want, but remember, tonight is the last chance for both of us. As Hugh returned to the house, her mind raced with conflicting emotions. Was she doing the right thing? Could she trust him to keep his word? And what about her family? In the end, Hugh knew that she had made the right choice, one that would protect them from further harm. The next day, as the family gathered once more, Hugh turned to her sons, Tan and Duong. Will you be staying another day, or should I expect you to help with the cooking tomorrow? She asked, trying to keep her tone light. We'll stay with the others, Mom, Than replied, but you can take my bike if you need it. Thank you, Hugh smiled, though deep inside she knew the battle she had fought was far from over. The events that had transpired had left a deep mark on her heart, but Hugh was determined to protect what mattered most, her family. The trip to the market and Vu's intentions. When you go shopping, there's always something you need to buy, right? Otherwise, wouldn't you just walk instead? So, what's your plan, Mom? How will you get home? I was thinking of asking Uncle Vu to give me a ride back. Okay, no problem. Can I come along too? Sure, why not? It's on the way, anyway. Besides, I'm heading home to meet up with some friends from the village. Great! I'll go get the car ready then. Just let me call Hugh and my wife to join us. On the way home, Vu quickly prepared the car and called his wife to stay at home. You go ahead and sleep. I'll drop by a friend's place for a drink. You're going out drinking at this hour? Come home early. Don't get too drunk. Don't worry, I'll be back soon. I'll have a drink, then head home. No need to wait up. Hugh overheard the conversation, realizing that Vu had planned everything with meticulous care. Upon reaching their destination, Vu parked the car, pretending to wander around for a while. When he returned, he saw his house door was already shut. Satisfied, he knocked on Hugh's door. Reluctantly, Hugh stepped out and opened it. When she entered the living room, she noticed Vu was acting strangely, like a completely different person. It startled her. Let me take a shower first. Where's your phone? Give it to me so I can delete the pictures. Why don't you let me delete them? Don't make me lose everything because of this. Fine, fine. You can do it, but you better not change your mind later. Hugh took the phone, almost trembling, and began deleting the photos with frustration. Every tap on the screen felt like another weight on her heart. Vu noticed her clenched teeth and sharp finger movements and smirked. Hey, come on, it's just a phone. Don't be so angry. It's not like you're deleting the world. His mocking tone made Hugh's blood boil, but she knew there was no turning back now. Despite being 34 years old with 2 children, Hugh had always kept herself in good shape. She had to, after all. Working as a saleswoman and also doing some lottery business in the evening meant she had to stay fit. But even though she worked hard to take care of herself, she couldn't escape the reality of what was happening now. The inevitable had arrived. Later, Vu quickly took his clothes and sat on the bed, waiting. Hugh lay there, exhausted, pretending to sleep. She would clean up the mess later, but for now, she needed to rest. When morning came and the rooster crowed, Hugh woke up. Seeing the aftermath of the previous night made her feel ashamed. She walked into the bathroom, staring at her disheveled hair, silently blaming herself. Why did I let this happen? Why did I let go of everything? She thought of Thai, her beloved husband who was locked away in prison, and compared it to what she had done with Vu. She had no choice but to protect her family. But how could she not feel guilty? Forgive me, Thai. I didn't want to hurt you, but I had no other option. She wiped the tears from her eyes as she turned on the shower, hoping the water would wash away her guilt. After the shower, Hugh quickly cleaned the room and went over to Long's house to help prepare the meal. As she walked through the house, she saw her two sons playing happily with their cousins. Hugh felt even more guilty. They had no idea what had happened the night before. Every now and then, she caught a glimpse of Vu's smug look as he glanced at her. His expression showed that he had gotten what he wanted. His plan to conquer his sister-in-law had succeeded. The only thing left was to claim her as his own, something he hadn't done yet. But even without that, he was content. He had made Hugh suffer, and that was enough for him. Later, the family gathered for the memorial feast. The men drank heavily, while the women chatted after the meal. The younger ones retreated to the bedroom to rest. In the early afternoon, the women began preparing for the return of Kwan and Kuei's families to Hanoi. Since they rarely came back to the village, everyone wanted to send them off with some gifts. Hugh's family didn't have fruit trees to offer, so they simply contributed what they could. Long, who had a few lychee trees in his backyard, turned to Hugh. "Theme Hugh, can you go pick some lychees for me? I need about 10 kilograms. I've got to leave for a bit, but when you're done, can you lock up the house? I'll be back soon." "Sure, no problem. I'll be quick." Long quickly left, but Vu, eager to lend a hand, interjected. "Let me help you pick the lychees. The trees are tall and the fruit is ripe. I'll climb up and get them for you." The scene begins with tension in the air. Hugh was still standing there, her face a mix of disbelief and discomfort. "What are you doing climbing up there?" she asked, avoiding eye contact. "You should just go home. I can handle it on my own." But Vu wasn't easily deterred. "No, I'll help you," he insisted, almost too forcefully. Hugh hesitated, but she didn't want to argue. "Let me give you a hand," La chimed in, eager to avoid further conflict. Hugh had no choice but to reluctantly agree. "Fine, let's just get this over with." Together, they walked to the orchard. As they reached the long, tall lychee tree, Hugh's gaze rose up, and she felt a twinge of anxiety. The tree was far too high, and the thought of climbing it made her uneasy. She wasn't accustomed to hard labor like this. Who would want to climb such a tree? She'd never imagined herself in this position. Usually, the hardest work she did was the household chores. But this felt like an entirely different challenge. Suddenly, Vu stepped closer. He placed a hand on her back. "What are you doing?" Hugh shrieked. "Do you want me to scream?" Vu laughed lightly. "Don't act so innocent. You were amazing last night." "Stop it, Vu," Hugh said sharply, backing away. "I won't stand for this." Vu smirked. "You're still upset about last night, aren't you?" "But honestly, I only did what I did for the happiness of our family." Hugh could feel the anger building inside her. How could he be so brazen? She clenched her fists, trying to suppress her rage. "Remember the deal we made?" Vu continued. "I erased the pictures you wanted, but you have to keep your part of the bargain too." "What are you talking about?" Hugh asked, confusion creeping into her voice. Vu reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, tapping it a few times before turning the screen to her. Hugh froze as she saw the images she thought he had deleted, the very same pictures she begged him to get rid of. No, she gasped. "You promised you'd delete them." Vu, with an almost mocking smile, said, "You didn't clear everything out of your phone, did you? You didn't check your trash folder?" Hugh's hands trembled as she stared at the photos. It was true. She had missed that step. But now, there was nothing she could do. She had to face the reality of the situation. "Get out of here! Leave me alone!" Hugh cried, her voice breaking. "If you show those pictures to the kids, what will they think of me?" Vu didn't flinch. "Well, they might start to understand just how much you've been hiding from them. You wouldn't want them to see the truth, would you?" Hugh felt her stomach twist. She was trapped, with no way out. Her mind raced, but her body felt numb. How could it have come to this? She glanced at the ground, tears welling up in her eyes. She wanted to scream, but something deep inside her held her back. What was left to fight for? Her voice quivered. Please don't do this. I've already suffered so much. How could I have been so blind? It was clear now. Vu had manipulated her, entangled her in his web of deceit. She had thought she could trust him, but now she understood the true nature of the trap he had set for her. As Hugh slowly walked away, the weight of her helplessness pressed down on her chest. She could feel the walls closing in, the darkness surrounding her. There was no way out. Not now. Later that evening, Vu was exhausted. He had spent the entire day drinking and socializing with his friends. They had gathered to celebrate one of their own purchasing a new motorcycle. It was just another excuse for them to drink and get rowdy. By the time Vu left his friends, he was far from sober. The alcohol was still buzzing in his system, making everything feel more intense. As he stumbled back home, he passed by Hugh's shop. The gate was closed, and he saw that the lights were dim. She must be resting, but that didn't stop him. The alcohol coursing through his veins made his thoughts clouded and reckless. He called out, "Hugh, are you there? Can you sell me a pack of cigarettes?" From inside, Hugh could hear his voice and felt an immediate unease. What did he want now? She paused, considering whether to ignore him or open the door. The truth was, if she didn't, he might cause a scene. So reluctantly, she walked to the door and opened it just enough to pass him the cigarettes. But Vu wasn't content with just that. He reached out, grabbing her hand with surprising force. "I missed you," he whispered. Hugh flinched, pulling her hand back. "What are you doing? People will see." His grip tightened and his breath was heavy with alcohol. "I don't care. I've missed you so much. You don't know how much I've been thinking about you." Huya recoiled, horrified by his behavior. This was the man she was married to, the one who had once promised her a future of love and respect. How had it all come to this? At that moment, Hugh's mind raced and her heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to scream, to call out for help, but no words came. Was there anyone who could hear her cry? The truth was, she felt utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Her thoughts turned to her children, to the life she had tried so hard to protect. Would they ever know the truth? She stood there, torn between the weight of her guilt and the ache of her frustration. The path ahead seemed unclear, the darkness too deep to see through. Yet somehow she knew that this was the moment that everything had changed. How much longer could she endure this? The weight of a broken promise and betrayal was too much to carry. Vu was relentless, and Hugh was at her breaking point. She had given everything, sacrificed so much, only to find herself here, in the middle of a war she had never wanted to fight. Her eyes filled with tears as she thought of her children, of the future she had once dreamed of. Was there any hope left for her? "Come on, just move your hand away. Let me in," he urged. She didn't want the neighbors to see this, did she? Hugh, feeling helpless, reluctantly stepped aside to let him in. As soon as she did, Vu quickly wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Go ahead, scream if you want," he teased. "Let Than and Duong hear you. I'll show them how beautiful their mother is." "Don't you dare," she warned. But just as Hugh was reaching the limit of her endurance, a sound suddenly interrupted the tension. It was the sound of the door opening downstairs. Vu quickly pulled back, retreating from her as if nothing had happened. It was Tan and Duong, getting up to go to school. By now, it was already past noon. Tan's school was about 6 or 7 kilometers away, so he had to ride his bike to get there. Duong, on the other hand, studied in the village and didn't have to travel as far. But both boys liked to go early, giving them more time to mess around with their friends. Hugh, relieved like someone who had found a treasure, quickly moved aside, adjusting her clothes. Vu called out, hearing the 2 boys coming up. "Tan, are you getting ready to go to school?" "Yes, we're going in the afternoon, but it's already late," Tan replied. "What brings you over, Uncle? Do you need something?" I'm just here to grab a pack of cigarettes, Vu said casually. By the way, are you guys playing football later? I saw some of the boys organizing a match with the neighboring village. Oh, really? What time? Thand asked, his eyes lighting up. About 5 in the evening, Vu answered. You'll have time to bike back before the match starts. Thand grinned with excitement. Great, I'll be there. With that, both boys rushed out the door to grab their bikes and head off to school. As they left, Vu turned back to Hugh. Damn, wait, your mom has something for you. Yes, Uncle? Vu quickly stopped in his tracks. He knew his chances were running thin now, so he did not dare act too boldly. Hugh, knowing the situation, handed him some cakes for the boys to take to school, reminding them to share with each other. Remember, when Vu leaves, lock the door behind him, she added. Hugh's words, though meant as a subtle hint, clearly signaled she was trying to push him away. But Vu, ever the tactician, wasn't one to back down so easily. He pulled out his phone and handed it to Than. Hey, could you check if my phone's working? It's been acting up lately. Hugh froze in shock. She hadn't expected Vu to be so daring. He seemed to know exactly how to push her buttons. With a quick glance, Hugh signaled him with a subtle gesture. What are you doing? She thought, but she had no choice but to comply. Vu smirked, noticing that Hugh had reluctantly given in. He instructed her, try calling my number. Check if the speaker's working fine. Hugh, feeling cornered, dialed the number. To her surprise, everything seemed fine. Looks like there's no issue, Hugh said, passing the phone back. Thank you, Vu replied, smiling. We old folks don't know much about gadgets anymore. You youngsters are the ones who know how to fix things. Yes, that's true, Hugh replied, trying to keep things casual. Now, go ahead and go to school. Don't be late. Vu, amused, casually mentioned, I'll grab the cigarettes and you close the door when I leave. Okay, take care. See you later. With that, Thon and Duong left for school. Once the boys had disappeared, Vu's grin widened. He knew his subtle manipulation had worked. He'd gotten what he wanted. As soon as the boys were out of sight, Vu turned his attention back to Hugh. Close the door behind me, will you? He said with a knowing look. Of course, she replied, but her heart sank. Vu went out to lock the door. Hugh stood there, helpless, knowing exactly what was coming next. She glanced around the house, spotting an open window. She quickly moved over to shut it, not wanting anyone from the village to see what was happening. But in her mind, she couldn't help but think about the consequences. The village residents would wake up soon, and their gossip would start. Even if they didn't know who was inside, the fact that her husband, Tai, was in prison would raise suspicions. It would be hard to keep the truth hidden, and the whispers of an affair would inevitably start. As Hugh pondered these thoughts, Vu entered the house. Let's go inside, he said, making it clear he didn't care who saw. I don't want anyone seeing us, Hugh protested, though she knew there was little she could do. Fortunately, it was midday, and few people were out, so they went inside the living room. Vu took a quick glance at the bedroom, but Hugh didn't want to go that far. She insisted they go upstairs to a room reserved for guests. Vu reluctantly agreed. Fine, whatever you say. As long as you're with me, I don't mind. In his mind, Vu knew he would have to work hard to break her resistance. He had his eyes set on Hugh, and he was determined to make her his, no one else's. That afternoon, an encounter unfolded between the two of them that shattered the boundaries of a typical brother-in-law and sister-in-law relationship. Vu, though well into his years, was thrilled and satisfied by the turn of events. But as for Hugh, she struggled with guilt. She had never imagined she would give in like this, but she had. At times, she wondered about her future and what consequences awaited her. Would she ever manage to untangle the mess she was in? But even in her moments of doubt, she didn't take any concrete steps to change things, and so she continued to live in the haze of uncertainty. The situation was such that she was left with no choice but to silently accept it. She did not defend the happiness of her small family, choosing instead to keep everything hidden and unspoken. The goods had been selling slower than usual, so Hugh had not yet needed to restock. This meant that Vu's only opportunity was during those quiet afternoons when Hugh would nap in the room upstairs above the shop. It was only during this time that Vu dared to approach the house. He knew very well that at night he could never dare to enter the lower house, not with the presence of Hugh's children. By day, Hugh had to manage her shop, selling goods and organizing the lottery tickets. She couldn't possibly allow him to show up at her door every time he felt like it. What if people noticed? What if rumors started to spread? In the weeks that followed, Vu would continue to find moments to visit her, waiting for her to be alone. One day, about a week after their last meeting, Vu appeared once more, showing up at the shop right after Hugh had finished lunch. Vu had been preparing for this. In the week of silence, he had bought a special bottle of liquor, a tonic that was said to boost male vitality. He knew his wife wouldn't care about such things. She was indifferent to his drinking habits, and at times she would even scold him if he overindulged. But he didn't care much. She was older now, less bothered by his behavior. On that afternoon, after they had finished their meal, Vu kept a close eye on the shop's traffic. He waited for a lull, for when the customers would leave and the time for a break would come. And then, just as he had planned, when Hugh and her two sons were about to finish lunch, Vu slipped into the house. Hugh had just locked the door and was preparing to nap upstairs when he appeared before her, suddenly, as though he had been waiting for the right moment. "Slow down," he said, grasping her hand gently. "Can I come in? It's the afternoon, and I miss you. I just wanted to check on you. Is that okay?" "Now. The kids are still at home," Hugh replied, hesitant. "If you come in now, others might notice." Vu didn't wait for her response. He pushed forward, smoothly entering the house before Hugh could stop him. "Don't worry," he said, smiling with his usual confidence. "The kids are sleeping. Why do you worry so much?" With a quick motion, he entered the house, leaving Hugh little choice but to follow him. As soon as she stepped inside, Vu started his usual behavior. He began his familiar pursuit of her, making Hugh feel increasingly helpless. "What are you doing?" she asked, feeling frustrated. "Are you out of your mind? Do you really think we can keep going like this?" Vu, sensing her resistance, softened his tone, even though his actions remained the same. His pursuit of Hugh seemed to be an obsession, one he couldn't easily shake off. He continued to shower her with attention, and even though she was exhausted, Hugh found herself somewhat accustomed to it. He had made her feel like his sole focus, and despite the discomfort, there was an undeniable part of her that had gotten used to the attention. "Can we just take a break?" Vu murmured, seeing that Hugh was tired. Before leaving, he whispered something in her ear, a suggestion that only made her feel more conflicted. Within moments, Hugh's two sons woke up from their nap. They wandered through the house, greeting their mother on their way out to school. Hugh, too tired to respond, simply acknowledged them with a silent nod. The boys, not knowing anything unusual had occurred, continued on with their day, oblivious to the secrets unfolding in the house. This continued for several weeks. About once or twice a week, Vu would sneak over in the afternoon when the shop was less busy, and Hugh had a moment to rest. These brief windows of time were the only moments they could steal for their secret meetings. Hugh, though reluctant, had grown used to the routine. Vu, on the other hand, paid more attention to his own health now. Approaching middle age, he had to watch his habits. His once frequent drinking had decreased, and he focused more on living a balanced life, although he still had moments of indulgence. Yet, despite this shift, he still craved these secret visits. He began relying more on his special tonic, hoping it would enhance his vitality and energy. His wife never asked about it. Even if she suspected something, she didn't care enough to confront him. She had long given up on trying to change him. Her body had aged, and her mind seemed to have grown weary of the years they'd spent together. She preferred to live peacefully, avoiding conflict as much as possible, especially now when she had grown content with the simplicity of life and her family. The status quo continued for a while until one day something unexpected happened. The factory had a seasonal sale, offering discounts on goods to clear out the warehouse. Hugh, eager to take advantage of the opportunity, decided to buy a large quantity of stock. She filled the entire warehouse to the brim, intending to distribute it to smaller stores. However, with such a large inventory, Hugh knew she would have to keep an eye on everything to prevent theft. So she planned to sleep in the storage room for a few nights until the goods were safely distributed. With her new plan in motion, Hugh resigned herself to the fact that she would have to spend more nights away from her own family. This situation, however, suited Vu's desires perfectly. Nighttime, when there were no time constraints, was his perfect window of opportunity. He knew that Hugh's sons were at an age where they preferred to stay up late, playing games or chatting with friends. They would never choose to sleep upstairs with their mother. And so Hugh found herself caught in this continuous cycle, balancing her responsibilities, her family, and the attention from Vu that she neither wanted nor could easily escape. There was no choice but to sleep alone that night in order to guard the goods. Vu seized the opportunity, telling his wife to hand him the spare key while she could go ahead and sleep. Whenever she returned, he would open the door himself. That evening, Vu sat at the water shop, chatting with a few young men or some men around his age. Whenever they grew tired of talking, they would pull out a chessboard or a deck of cards to pass the time. Vu's main goal was to keep Hugh from closing the shop early and going to bed. Although Hugh no longer had much resistance when it came to his advances, she still tried to delay the inevitable, at least out of a sense of duty. It was the last bit of respect a wife could show her husband, but Vu simply stayed where he was, and Hugh found herself unable to get rid of him. Time passed slowly as Vu continued to chat and play cards with the men. Occasionally, he noticed some of the younger men stealing glances at his sister-in-law, which gave him a strange sense of satisfaction. No matter what people said, for the past month he had enjoyed the pleasures of her beautiful, hot body. However, there was one thing that bothered him: Tung. This man was nearly a decade older than Vu, already close to 60, yet he couldn't seem to stop staring at Hugh, as if he were about to devour her whole. It disgusted Vu to see the man leering at his wife and making crude comments about her. There were moments when Vu felt like taking action, even considering confronting Tung, but for now he decided to let it go. Despite the discomfort, it did amuse him to know that other men were envious of what he had. By 10 p.m. the shop closed, and naturally Vu was the last one to leave. He remained behind with the shopkeeper, while the two younger nephews were reminded to go to bed early, as they had been every night for the past month. Once the doors were shut, Vu took the opportunity to slip into the house. The time was now 11 p.m., and the house was eerily quiet. He had seen Hugh several times before, bending over while carrying goods or when she wore a loose blouse. His thoughts raced. As he stood by the window, he suddenly froze when he heard Hugh's voice coming from inside. She was standing by the window looking outside. Dung, curious, moved closer and peeked inside. What he saw shocked him. Hugh wasn't as modest as he had imagined. He was excited but also slightly drunk, and in a moment of impulsiveness, he decided to record a short video. Dung didn't know it, but that simple action, recording a brief moment of Hugh at the window, would change everything for both of them. He couldn't stop thinking about it as he walked back home. When he lay down on his bed, his thoughts were consumed by the woman he had just glimpsed. What he had witnessed in that moment was a chance he had never had before. He wanted to be the one to possess her, not that old man Vu. Dung was frustrated. The thought that an older man like Vu had already had a piece of what he wanted made his blood boil, but the video he had just recorded gave him a sense of power. He realized that with this footage, he could control the situation. Maybe he could use it to his advantage to get what he wanted from Hugh, and perhaps even get back at Vu. It was only a matter of time before Dung began to plot his next move. The video was a valuable asset, something that could help him gain access to the woman he had been obsessing over for so long. And now he was more determined than ever to make her his own. This video isn't exactly the smartest move, it's more like a trap, a plot to damage the old man while avoiding confrontation, and at the same time achieving the goal. The next day, it seemed like nothing else mattered in its mind. All it could think about were the schemes, the plans. How could it bring down the old man? It imagined the scenario where the old man would be humiliated, and it made him furious. Then, like a sudden flash of inspiration, it dawned on him that the people around the old man, his circle, were all gambling enthusiasts. Just recently, when they played the lottery, those same gambling addicts didn't hesitate, taking risks with their money, often losing it all. The villagers, for the most part, turned a blind eye and ignored it. Though they were well aware of the destruction that gambling brought to families, homes destroyed, lives shattered, who dared speak up? Even the local police, bound by the so-called village solidarity, turned a blind eye to it. After all, catching gamblers didn't bring any real glory or recognition. But that wasn't the case with the district police. They were always waiting for an opportunity to make a name for themselves, to rise up. Arresting outsiders and receiving credit for it? That's something they could proudly display. Through his uncle, Dung understood the situation perfectly. That's when he devised a plan to destroy the old man. One morning, as he walked through the market, he overheard some of the fishmongers gossiping. They were talking about the old man's family, saying that his wife and children had borrowed over 100 million Vietnamese dong, but still owed 400 million. The bank refused to lend them more, and they couldn't pay back the original loan. The worst part was that the children had to work tirelessly for over a year just to pay off that debt. It was all because of their father, the head of the village, whose reckless and heartless actions had driven them to this point. The gossiping women concluded that the only solution was for the old man to serve a prison sentence. His family disagreed with the idea of selling the house, knowing that if they did, they would be left homeless. The old man had no sense of remorse, and the family was torn over what to do next. In the end, they decided that the only way to resolve this was to let him go to jail and not pay a single penny. As Dung listened to the conversation, he felt a surge of joy. It was as if he had just won a prize. He could already imagine the old man behind bars, his biggest rival removed from the path ahead of him. This was a huge step toward achieving his dream. That night, as Dung sat down for dinner, the neighbors came by and talked about how the old man's family had gone to visit him in prison. They discussed how they considered selling their house to pay off the debts, but ultimately realized it was impossible. The old man's wife and children had disagreed with the plan, and in the end they had no other option but to let him face the consequences of his actions. Dung could barely contain his satisfaction as he listened to these stories. He was already savoring his victory, knowing that his main obstacle was now out of the picture. The day of the sentencing arrived, and the old man was given a 5-year sentence for gambling. 3 of his accomplices were released with administrative fines, while the old man faced a full prison sentence. When Dung heard the news, he celebrated like a soccer player who had just scored the winning goal. He ran around the room shouting in triumph. It was a moment of pure bliss. Meanwhile, Hugh, upon hearing that the old man had been sentenced to prison, felt a deep sense of relief. Finally, she wouldn't have to endure his constant harassment. Though she had enjoyed some of the pleasures he had provided, her role as a wife soon brought her back to her senses. That night, she slept better than she had in a long time. For the first time in ages, she felt free. For the next week, Dung was on cloud 9. He couldn't stop smiling, basking in the victory of having eliminated his biggest rival. But, of course, there was still one more challenge ahead of him. The challenge he wanted to conquer more than anything in the world. He had never liked the old man's face, and the fact that the old man had won the affection of the woman he desired only fueled his bitterness. Dung couldn't get the image of the old man out of his mind, particularly the sight of Hugh clinging to the window frame, deep in thought. Every time he remembered it, a burning anger rose within him, yet it also spurred him on. This was his motivation to take back everything he felt he had lost. While sitting in class, Dung's mind was constantly racing with plans on how to approach Hugh. He wondered if he could use the video he had of her to manipulate the situation, but that didn't seem like a good idea. After all, how could he get close to her without raising suspicion? He knew that the video would be enough to control her, but he needed the right moment, the right time. The best strategy would be to isolate the two of them, away from the prying eyes of others. But that posed another challenge. How could he create such a situation? At the same time, Dung had to plan his next steps carefully. He couldn't keep running back to her house. It was risky. He also had to deal with her 2 sons, who would complicate things further. But Dung was patient. He would bide his time, waiting for the right moment to strike. Perhaps in the meantime, it would be wise to focus on his health and fitness. He knew he would need to be strong for what lay ahead. And then, the perfect opportunity presented itself. One Saturday evening, when Hugh's 2 sons, Thun and Duong, had gone out to play, Hui's mother-in-law came over to visit her. After her husband passed away, and with her son living far away to pursue his career, Hugh's mother-in-law often felt lonely. Sometimes Hugh had suggested that she move in with them, especially now that Vu was in prison, but the old woman refused. She wanted to stay in her home, maintaining the ritual of honoring her late husband and waiting for the return of her son. However, she would often visit her daughter and grandchildren on weekends. That Saturday, as the evening progressed, Hugh's mother-in-law came over again, just as she had many times before. This time, Dung saw it as an opportunity. The moment had arrived. Once again, the woman found herself under the control of another person. Yet, everything continued as normal until Hugh, on her motorbike, decided to tie a cart to the back and return it to her biological mother. She had borrowed it the other day for some work, and now that she saw her mother visiting, she remembered to bring some tea. Her intention was to make the most of the opportunity since her mother was at home. She didn't want her to have to haul that cart alone the next day, especially with a few bicycles piled onto it. After all, her mother was already in her late 60s. Hugh thought, even a little help is better than none. With that in mind, she grabbed her AB motorbike, tied the rope to the front of the cart, and fastened it to the rear of her motorbike. Then, she began to pull the cart. The road was bumpy, causing the cart to change direction unpredictably. At one point, the cart nearly collided with a person riding a motorcycle. Hugh was unsure of what to do next, but just then, she spotted Dung standing at the door of her house. She called out to him, "Dung, are you free? Can you help me hold the cart while I bring it into the house?" Dung, clearly thrilled at the chance to assist, eagerly replied, "Yes, I was just waiting for you. I'll help right away. Where are Thun and Duong? Why would you be carrying this alone?" Hugh laughed softly and replied, "Oh, those 2 ate and then ran off to play. But now that my mom is visiting, someone needs to watch the shop, so I'm finally getting this cart back. It's probably because it's Saturday and they want to have some fun." Dung continued, muttering under his breath, "Those 2 always find a way to sneak off when it's time to work." Without hesitation, he rushed over, untied the rope from the front of the cart, and tossed it into the back. Then he hopped onto the motorbike, sitting closely beside Hugh, grabbing the handlebars to steady the cart. "All right, we're all set. Let's go," he declared with confidence. His words signaled Hugh to rev the engine and take off. His statement also served to reassure Hugh, as his proximity helped allay any doubts she had. The journey wasn't too far, but it wasn't exactly close either. It took them about 10 minutes to reach their destination. During the ride, Dung couldn't help but inhale the sweet, familiar scent of Hugh's presence. He marveled, how does she smell so good? It's like her warmth just fills the air. He admired her closeness, feeling the softness of her presence, even though they were just on a motorbike. As they neared Hugh's house, Dung was already plotting his next move in his mind, preparing for the right moment to make his move. However, just as they reached the halfway point, the weather suddenly changed. A heavy summer rain poured down unexpectedly. They hadn't traveled far, barely a kilometer, but the rain soaked them completely. Still, Hugh, determined to get the cart home, continued on. The journey wasn't long enough to stop her, and they were both drenched as they arrived at her house. Hugh quickly moved the cart into the storage shed, then called out to Dung, "Quick, go lock the door. I don't want anyone sneaking in and taking the cart when we're not looking. Once you're done, come up to the house." Dung nodded and did as instructed, heading up to the house. When he stepped inside, his eyes were immediately drawn to the three-room house. The living room was in the center, where a shrine stood in honor of Hugh's late father and grandparents. On the left side of the living room was the bed where Hugh's mother usually rested, while on the right was a set of guest chairs. The kitchen was in the back on the right, and next to it, on the left, was the bedroom where Hugh's brother, her younger sibling, used to sleep. However, Hugh's brother rarely stayed at the house anymore because he had moved to Hanoi to work, only coming home once or twice a year. Dung had often noticed that the house seemed quiet and empty, especially when he came to visit. Perhaps it was due to the house being situated on the edge of the village, near the fields. He didn't fully understand, but the area was isolated, and the land next door had recently been sold to a man originally from the village who now lived in Hanoi. The man only visited the area occasionally, likely only returning to retire later in life. As the storm raged on outside, Dung shivered, feeling the chill from the rain seeping into his clothes. The thunder and lightning were almost as frightening as the downpour. He sneezed, and Hugh, now inside the house, laughed softly. "Look at us, drenched like two rats. Don't worry, I'll find something for you to wear." With that, Hugh walked over to the bedroom and opened the wardrobe, searching for one of her younger brother's old t-shirts. She found a short-sleeved shirt and handed it to Dung. "Here, you can wear this. You'll catch a cold if you stay like that." Dung watched intently, noticing how Hugh moved with grace, her every motion almost hypnotic. As she reached into the wardrobe, the fabric of her shirt clung to her curves, and Dung couldn't help but notice how alluring she looked. He couldn't help but feel a rush of warmth as he stared, his mind racing with thoughts he hadn't fully realized before. She quickly realized that he was trying to close his legs to avoid being noticed. Hugh handed a set of clothes to Dung, saying, "Here, change quickly. If we stay in wet clothes, we'll both end up soaked, and that would be a hassle." "Yes, sister," Dung replied, nodding. "Wait a moment," he added before grabbing the clothes and running into the room. He noticed the door wasn't locked but was only covered by a thin curtain, a modest solution in this simple house. Dung nodded, relieved to hear that. "Then we just need to wait for the right moment. Once we get that phone, we can make sure everything is gone, once and for all. No more threats, no more fear." He glanced at her, his eyes softening. "You're not alone, Hugh. I'll help you. You can trust me." A deep sigh escaped Hugh's lips as she looked down at the phone in her hands. "I don't know what I would have done without you. Thank you." Dung gave her a reassuring smile, his eyes filled with determination. "No need to thank me. We're in this together. I'll make sure nothing happens to you. I won't let that man destroy you." But even as he said those words, the weight of their situation hung over them. They both knew that this was far from over. The storm was far from passing. and the danger was still very real. The phone, if it were to fall into the wrong hands, everything would be exposed. Hugh couldn't help but feel a deep sense of worry at the thought. She knew that if she didn't act quickly to eliminate any evidence, it was only a matter of time before something unexpected happened. Her anxiety grew with each passing second, and her mind raced as she thought of possible solutions. Dung, after thinking for a moment, came up with a plan. During the day, the old man Vu's house is usually just his wife and grandson. His wife doesn't know much about technology. I think you could use that to your advantage. Hugh nodded slowly, but still seemed uncertain. But how? I mean, how do I get her to hand over the phone without raising any suspicion? She asked, trying to make sense of the situation. Dung thought for a while before replying, "Well, Vu's wife doesn't know much about phones anyway. Most people just use them to make calls or watch some light entertainment. You could visit during the day and spend time with the grandson. Maybe watch some children's shows on the phone to distract her. Once she's occupied, you can guide her through the process of opening something on the phone, and while she's distracted, you can quickly delete everything." Hugh hesitated. "But what if I panic and forget what to do when the time comes?" she asked, still anxious. Dung looked at her firmly and said, "At this point, what do you have to lose? If you don't act decisively now, things could spiral out of control. You've got to be strong. Do this for yourself." He encouraged her with a confident, reassuring tone. His words struck a chord with Hugh. For the first time in a while, she felt a glimmer of hope. This could be the way out of her situation, the path to reclaiming her life. No more threats, no more living under someone else's control. For a long time, she had felt trapped in a cycle of guilt, constantly worrying about the consequences of her actions. But now, for the first time, she began to realize that maybe she could change her circumstances. And although she felt a mix of fear and relief, there was a part of her that felt truly liberated. Despite the relief she felt, Hugh couldn't help but think of Dung. It was strange, but even though she had been married to Vu for so long, her thoughts were often consumed by Dung. It was said that people get used to what they know, but sometimes the unfamiliar feels more enticing. When night came, she found herself dreaming not of her husband, but of Dung. She realized that this was just another twist in the complex emotions she had been dealing with. Determined not to make any more mistakes, Hugh decided to keep a close eye on her children. She made them stay at the shop with her, making sure they stayed focused on their studies. She couldn't afford to let them fall into bad habits, especially with the social dangers all around. Keeping them occupied and under her watchful eye was the best way to ensure their safety. It also kept them from becoming targets for the local boys, who might try to take advantage of her vulnerable situation. And so, Hugh carefully managed her household. She worked hard to shield her children from the temptations and dangers of the world, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of dread whenever she thought about Vu, who was still out there. She knew that the battle was far from over, and there was still much to be done. As the months went by, the day came when Thai was finally released from prison. Hugh had been waiting for this day for so long. Thai had changed after his time in prison. He had become more focused on his work, determined to turn things around for himself and his family. He closed down the old shops and opened a new business, a restaurant specializing in dog meat, something he had learned to do while in prison. The children, now older, were hesitant when their father returned home. They were afraid of his reaction, unsure of what to expect, but to their surprise, Thai didn't scold them. Instead, he worked hard to rebuild their lives. His business grew steadily, and soon the family was in a much better financial position. Hugh felt a sense of pride as she watched her children grow up, knowing that they were safe, loved, and supported by their father, who had changed for the better. For the first time in years, Hugh began to understand what true happiness felt like. She had fought through so many challenges, but now, with Thai's support and her own determination, She felt like she had finally found peace. It had been a long, hard journey, but it was worth it. So after everything, after the threats, the struggles, the fear, Hugh had finally found her way out. She had been set free from the control of others, and now her family was reunited and rebuilding their lives together. This story, though filled with trials and tribulations, is ultimately one of hope. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, change is possible. Hugh had been through so much, but she didn't give up. She fought for herself, for her children, and for a better future. We hope that after hearing Hugh's story, you find the strength to face your own struggles, no matter how insurmountable they may seem. And just like Hugh, we believe that you too can overcome the obstacles in your life. Thank you for taking the time to watch this story. We truly appreciate your support and hope to see you again soon in our future stories. Until then, take care and remember, no matter how tough life gets, there is always hope.